First of all, thank you, David, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank the sponsors of tonight's event. I'm really excited about being here and talking about growing up in the segregated South. And I want to make sure that as I'm going through to share some parallels between my development and growth in Selma, Alabama, and what I see is happening now in the Twin Cities. And in some ways, I think that, 1964 is still here today in 2015. So I want to make sure that, I hope you can see this behind me. This bridge is a symbol of part of the civil rights movement in Selma. I grew up, that is the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It is the bridge that is, how many of you saw Selma? Let me ask that first. How many of you saw the movie Selma? If you haven't, I believe that that's a film that you should see. So this bridge is a bridge that I often rode my bike across and visited friends across, and my mom didn't know because she thought it was dangerous. But my husband took this picture when we went back in February 2015 for the 50th celebration of the march from Selma to Montgomery. And I will tell you that, and this is a math problem, I asked someone my age in a few minutes. I was born 6 years after Brown v. Board of Education, 5 years after Brown v. Board of Education, and 6 years before the Civil Rights Act was signed and put into action. But what I want to say is that I was born just like all of you, into the world, innocent, without biases and without any values or anything interpreting for me. I was this innocent babe, and my friend Dan Lawrenson over there and his wife, Mark, oh God, she's so forgive me, just had a little baby, and these babies are born really innocently. But the reality is I was born in a segregated hospital. I went home with my mom and dad to a segregated community, and we worshiped in segregated churches. We shopped in segregated grocery stores. And so my entire experience was one that was segregated. And there was no interaction with other people, much less the diversity you see here in Minneapolis. What was really interesting about that is that my thoughts about white people was based on what I saw on the one channel we got in Selma, and that was, Dean Martin with a glass in his hand singing, "Everybody loves somebody sometime." So, or quite frankly, Billy Graham, which I loved Billy Graham, and I just couldn't wait to hear him. So my interaction with race at a young age was what I saw on television, and that was very limited. But let me share with you what happened when I went to school. I went to a one-room schoolhouse that was a school that was a church school, and that experience was totally supportive. Black teachers, black principal, and everything was just supportive, and the teacher made me feel really good about myself. And we stayed in a black school, that school for a while, and then my mom taught in a black elementary school, so then she took us to school with her. And my proudest joy was the teacher really would call on me when she would show the outlines of the state. She would say, "Bernadeia, do you know what this state is?" I'm like, "Yes, Minnesota." I knew the outline of the state, and I was very proud of that experience. And my other experience with other is when we came to Minneapolis to visit my grandmother, there used to be a place called Young Quinlan downtown. My sister and I were walking downtown, and we saw an Asian woman, and we were pointing at her, and my grandmother, and I'm sure it was just embarrassing, but she took us by the hand and took us over to the young woman and explained to her, "My little granddaughters are from Selma, Alabama, and they've only seen white people, and they've never seen anyone that looks like you." So she used that as a teaching experience. And so that was part of my experience growing up in elementary school. And my mom, when schools became integrated, what was really interesting about that, as you know, the southern states were really slow in honoring the law. And my mom decided that we would go to a white school. And because still to this day there's no busing in the city of Selma, she had to pay a cab driver to pick us up every morning at our home to drive us to the white school across town. Because, as I said, the communities were segregated, so all the black schools were in the black community. And when we got there, my sister and I were the two black children that integrated this school first. And it was really interesting to be in a school with white students for the first time. And our experience was one that of isolation, of humiliation, and not one of high expectations. I remember that my sister, right after coming, we were just coming back from Minneapolis from summer vacation with my grandparents. The teacher, as all teachers ask, "What did you do for the summer?" And my sister said, "Well, we went to Montgomery and we got on an airplane and we flew to Minnesota." And the teacher told my mom that my sister was making up stories, that she could not fathom that a little black girl would get on an airplane and fly to Minneapolis. And my mom said, "No, that's true. Their grandparents are in Minneapolis, and that's where they spend their summers." So that was my first time, and I remember that story distinctly, and so does my sister, because it was the first time that someone that had just expectations that it was no way that we could have that experience. Now, for some people in Selma, that was true, but we were fortunate because we had grandparents that lived in Minneapolis. And after that, we moved on to middle school. My first real integrated experience where I had intercultural relations and connections with white people is when I was in the band. So, you start to form relationships with people when you're in a group together, and kind of an infinity group. And I started to really feel more comfortable around white people. But I will tell you that though I went to school, as I said, in an integrated environment, and it was more integrated by this point, I would go to the grocery store with my mom and see one of my white friends. We would look at each other, but we would never wave, we would never acknowledge each other's existence, because that's just not what you did. And so I continued to have experiences like that. And when I moved off to high school, it became even clearer to me that expectations were different for me than from some of my white friends. And I guess friends is used loosely at that point, that I had people in what was called college classes and honors courses, and I was in the level 2 classes, and they were in level 1, which means I was being tracked on a level of classes that was expected for me. And I remember going to the black counselor and saying that I wanted to take some level 1 classes, and she was discouraging to me and said that I should not be in those classes, which was very disappointing when I reflect back on that experience. And as I think about being the superintendent of Minneapolis Public Schools, when there were students in schools across the district, mostly I would say Southwest schools, where students had options and access to IB, but not necessarily students of color. So I remember one of my first deeds that got me in trouble with the community, so keep track of them, was when I removed entry requirements. You had to write an essay, you had to have a teacher recommendation. It was almost like applying to college. The access was just not the same. And so I'm proud to say when I left the district, we saw a greater increase of students of color in high-level courses in Minneapolis, advanced placement, college in the schools, and IB, and more women in those courses as well. So when I say things are different, yet they're the same thing I dealt with when I was in high school was the same thing that I dealt with as the superintendent of Minneapolis Public Schools. And as I went on and thought about my experiences, Rachel, where are you? Okay. Thought about my experiences in Minneapolis, also with students trying to just have general access and integration efforts across the district. I will tell you that we've struggled with that as a system. And just a little plug here, on Wednesday I'll be on NPR talking about integration, so I'm not gonna go into all that tonight. But one of the things that I wanted to share, my husband is here with me tonight. Our parents tried to protect us from what was going on in the community. It was ugly, it was nasty, and though they talked to us about it, they really didn't want to instill fear into us. So my uncle, who was what was called one of the people called the Courageous Eight, he tried to register people to vote. And I remember one weekend I spent the night at his house, and we were, playing in the living room as we probably weren't supposed to do. And then some trucks drove up into the driveway, and the lights were bright on the house, and we were all up against the wall because we were afraid. We didn't know who it was and what it was. We found out later it was the Klan who were coming because they were trying to intimidate him and his family from the work that he was doing. So I'm very proud of my little small town with a big history, and I'm also very cognizant of the fact that the things that we are talking about and addressing today are not dissimilar for what kids are dealing with. So those are a couple of examples that I wanted to share with you. I would say that another one that's really important when I talk about being sheltered, my husband will tell you when his mom wanted to go to town to buy him shoes, she took his foot and put it on a piece of white paper, traced the outline of his foot, and went to town to buy his shoes so that he didn't have to tolerate or experience some of the challenges that were going on in the community at the time. So it was a time of fear, it was a time of intimidation, but it was also a time of great pride and respect. So as I said, the churches were segregated. So going to church on Sunday was the time you went to get your lesson on civil rights. The ministers got up and talked about the issues that were going on in the community, as well as giving the call of action to the community about what needed to happen. So when you're young and you're starting to learn that at an early age, it's really important. And I believe black ministers always, for me, have been important in the fight for civil rights and for equity across this country. And I saw that very much in the city of Selma. And we also had to think about where we got our news from. So that's when you saw the rise of black papers like Ebony and Jad magazine. Is where black people got their news about what was going on nationally, because if somebody else told you, it was being filtered through some other venue, and that's how you got your real news about what was going on in the community. So it was a time when the community cared a lot about its children, and still does, in terms of having high expectations. But a real meaning of, I would say, a real meaning of education and integration was, at that time, I thought was so far away, and I would say that it still is. And so I struggle with how we think about integrating schools and who integrates what schools and how that happens. I had a friend tonight who was going to attend, and she couldn't come. Melissa Cruz, she was the superintendent of Eden Prairie School District. And if you talk about the issues of trying to integrate schools, she caught it. And I will tell you, it's political, it's challenging, and it's career-ending, quite frankly. And so when you go into this work and you think about it, you really have to decide what you're going to stand for and what will happen. And so, speaking of stand, I'm glad to share the stage tonight with Cora Lee. So I look forward to hearing you. It's always good to involve children in this work. So I would say that if you think about a little black girl growing up in Selma and thinking about all the things that were consistently there and ever present in my family and in my life, I would say that all those things have made me stronger, have made me think more about race, and made me think more about people and their intentions and their actions. And I've seen a difference in the way that people go about, thinking about people, as human beings, and about humanity just in general. And I would say that march across that bridge from Selma to Montgomery was the one that I will tell you, in the movie, I just cringed to see that and see what happened when people really were fighting just for human decency and just access. And I hope that this community challenges itself to think about how they think about equity, how they think about race, and more importantly, how they think about how they want our community to exist for the children of this community. And I could go on and talk about different issues, but I think at a high level, I want to make sure that Cora Lee has time, and I really want to entertain some questions. So thank you for your time, and thank you for listening.